When you're looking at your blood work, which numbers are important and which ones are not? What can we eat to decrease our cholesterol? And what are the top 4 things that we can do to reduce the chances of getting Alzheimer's disease? Today's episode with Dr. Matthew Dawson, the CEO and co-founder of Wild Health, is a special one. We'll dive into my personal blood work results, my genetic testing results, and he'll tell me what to take away from it and how you can leverage these tests to improve your health as well. Now, Dr. Matthew Dawson has had an obsession with performance optimization for a long time. It started when he was a high school athlete, a college athlete. He actually played 2 sports in college, and he carried this obsession with him through medical school and into his profession as a physician. And he earned numerous national awards for education, innovation, and leadership on account of his research and just his approach to healthcare. He then crystallized his approach to providing patients with true healthcare rather than sick care by building his company Wild Health, which is a precision medicine service providing personalized genetics-based care to help patients achieve optimal well-being. In that, Dr. Dawson has also trained thousands of physicians in precision medicine through online education, and he's lectured in over 20 countries across the world. If you care to get your genetic testing done with Wild Health, then they are, for a limited time, giving listeners of the Best You podcast 20% off of their order. You can go to the link in the description and use the code TheBestYou20 for 20% off at your checkout. Again, TheBestYou20 for 20% off at your checkout. For now, it's time to get closer and closer to your best you with the one and only Dr. Matthew Dawson. All right, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Best You podcast. Today, I am super excited because we've got a unique episode. We're joined by the one and only Dr. Matthew Dawson. Matthew Dawson is the CEO and founder at Wild Health, and a lot of you guys know I recently got a genetic testing done from Wild Health, and simultaneously I got done some blood work, and then I had some calls with a coach and a medical professional within Wild Health and got some great feedback as to my results with the blood work and the genetic testing and what I should maybe change or add in or reduce in my lifestyle with regards to fitness and nutrition and everything like that. And so I'm really excited today to talk about blood work and genetic testing as a whole, and then potentially talk about some of it specifically based on my results and everything like that. So really excited to talk today. The way I want to start, though, is kind of start the conversation with blood work and then later on transition into genetic testing. So with blood work, I think a lot of people immediately will look to cholesterol levels, but talk to me holistically when you're looking at blood work. What is the most important thing to be looking at and why?
Yeah, so good question. So in health, anytime somebody asks me like what's the most important thing, I kind of think of like someone like looking at a Picasso painting and say what's the most important color. Like it all works together, but it's a fair question. So and it's very, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, Nick, with these questions, but it's very personalized. So I will give you a couple of general answers, but what I would say the general approach when thinking about what's most important is we really have to start with a holistic picture. Like we are not a collection of organ systems, we're a whole person. So that's why we do the DNA testing, which we'll talk about later. That's your human operating system. So I need to know that. It's crazy to me that people take care of patients without knowing that operating system, what all advantages, disadvantages you have, what risk factors you may have. And that is going to determine to me what the most important blood markers are as well. So once I have that operating system, your DNA is not your destiny. That's only about 20% of your health outcome. The other 80% are epigenetics and what you do, how you turn those genes on and off. So what foods you eat, how you sleep, your stress levels, what you're exposed to. And I measure your potential with your DNA and then where you are right now with your blood work. So we'll get into the blood work part. And I want to look at everything that makes you feel and perform a certain way. All your vitamins, minerals, nutrients, hormones, the cholesterol and stuff, that's going to have to do with more your future risk factors. So I need a holistic picture of you to say what's important to start. Because let's say, for example, you had an ApoE4 gene, really high risk for dementia. So then I'm thinking about what's going to increase your risk of that when it comes to your blood tests. And it may be your Lp(a), LDLP, some of the cholesterol markers, but it also is going to be your metabolic health, your A1C, your insulin, those types of things. Whereas if you tell me you have a certain symptom or you're not sleeping well or other things, then it may be different blood markers like your A1C and your cholesterol isn't going to affect how you sleep or some of your other symptoms. So what's most important to you is going to depend on what's going on with you, how you feel, your genetics, what your goals are, how old you are, and all of that. So happy to get into specific blood work, but it's kind of a very personalized approach, and that's the approach that we take.
Yeah, for sure. So, like you said, it's going to be dependent on what you're currently experiencing feeling wise and what your genetics are and what they show. But let's say somebody at this point in time, they've never done a genetic test before, but they've heard that cholesterol levels are important to look at with regards to cardiovascular disease and stuff like that. What is your interpretation of the truth with regards to cholesterol, LDL, HDL, triglycerides, all that kind of stuff? Because I think the conversation around that can oftentimes get confusing for people and what's actually important. So just kind of like run with that whole conversation of what you feel is important with regards to maybe cardiovascular disease as we get older.
For sure. And what's the truth depends on what's the question. So I'm going to give a couple questions so I can see what I mean by that. Yesterday I was talking to a patient who is kind of in his late 50s. So I'm going to compare and contrast him to you when I think about cholesterol. So if you were to ask me for yourself, is cholesterol important for you? Like, hey, is it important for myself? I would say, what do you mean? For how you feel and perform right now? Not really. Like, it's not going to make you feel and perform a certain way. And then you say, well, okay, I'm talking about my dementia and risk and my cardiovascular risk 40 years from now, in which case I say, absolutely, it's important. And so we'll want to potentially optimize it, but not at the expense of something else. I'm not going to put you potentially, let's say your LDLP is elevated, but it's just a little elevated. I'm probably not going to jump straight to a statin for you because you're young, healthy. I don't want to cause muscle breakdown, myopathy, stuff like that. So it's personalized. If you were super high, you had familial cholesterolemia, and you had these ridiculous numbers, then I'm like, yeah, like Nick, we need to get this down now. So let me tell you how I approached it with this patient because it's a good overview of how to think about cholesterol. Why do we care about cholesterol? I don't care because of the number on the paper. What I care about it for is how it affects your risk later. Number one risk that's going to kill you and I as Americans is cardiovascular disease. Does cholesterol affect your risk of cardiovascular disease? 100%. Does it mean we need to push your cholesterol down? Not necessarily. So with this gentleman, I'm talking to him and his LDLP, which is a good marker to look at. If you're going to look at one, it's probably ApoB. But for him, he was worried about his LDLP, which is a similar correlation. It was elevated. And then the question became, do we need to do something about it? So here's what I told him is why I care is because I want to know if you're at increased risk of having a heart attack, and you're going to be increased risk of a heart attack if you start having plaque buildup in your arteries. So with him, instead of saying immediately we're going to push this down, I said, do you have plaque in your arteries? So the way that you build that up is with elevated cholesterol, inflammation, these types of things going on. It all has to happen at the same time, damage to the lining, to these blood vessels, and have these increased bad molecules floating around. Well, we've got a test for, do you have plaque? We had just gotten a clearly scan, so an AI CTA of him 2 years ago. And when we looked at that, he had very minimal plaque. And at the time, it wasn't enough to say we're going to treat your cholesterol. His cholesterol has gotten worse over these 2 years. So what we decided now is we're going to get a repeat scan so that we can see the velocity. Are you laying down more plaque, or are you completely stable? If you're completely stable, then what that tells me is even though you've got some bad cholesterol floating around, it's not causing damage because you're exercising, you're eating healthy, you don't have inflammation. So I'm not going to put you on a medication. We're just going to keep following that end result. The cholesterol is only important because of the end result. If the end result isn't happening, that number I'm not scared of. So thinking of it holistically and what we're trying to treat and how we have better tests. And I told him if he is increasing with his velocity, we're going to put him on a medication. He's very active. He cycles competitively. We're going to skip a statin. We're going to go to Repatha, which is a once every couple of weeks injection if he's really laying that plaque down.
Gotcha. That's definitely super helpful. So with regards to other, maybe like dietary behavior in particular, and how that influences cholesterol levels, I think that a lot of people have the misnomer that if you eat cholesterol, it's going to increase your cholesterol levels. But basically it's pretty well known that dietary cholesterol doesn't really influence your serum or your blood cholesterol all that much. First off, tell me if I'm wrong there. Second off, what other nutritional behaviors impact cholesterol levels?
Yeah, no, you're correct. Just eating cholesterol doesn't necessarily raise it. What we see probably raises cholesterol the most is eating a lot of saturated fat. So that doesn't mean necessarily that saturated fat is bad. Um, so a perfect example of this is my co-founder, Mike Mallon. He and I, 6 years ago when we got into this, we sequenced our DNA when we first starting out. And one of the things we noticed, a real aha moment for us, is we looked at his DNA. He had all these markers that made him very sensitive to saturated fat. I had none of them. So we hypothesized, and he had really high cholesterol at the time, dangerous levels. So we hypothesized that it looks like he needs to be almost on a vegan diet, and I can eat as much animal fat as I want, like a ketogenic diet. And we tried this out. We would do these experiments where for like 2 weeks we'd both eat like a vegan diet. We do the same workouts, trying to crush each other, measure our blood markers, and sure enough, on his diet, I felt like crap. I performed poorly. My markers went everywhere. On my diet, animal proteins, like the sardines you and I were talking about earlier, like plenty of saturated fat. He felt horrible. I killed him in the workouts, and his inflammatory markers, cholesterol went nuts. So while I say saturated fat increases it, it depends genetically if you're really sensitive to it or not. The other thing I would say is refined carbohydrates as well, and looking at those can play a role in making your bad cholesterol worse.
I've also heard that fiber intake is something that influences cholesterol and brings cholesterol down. Is that true or not? Or do you know much or could explain any more on that?
For sure. It's just as simple as it binds the cholesterol molecules more. So that is totally true. Two things. When you're eating a lot of fiber, it takes up a lot of room in your gut. So you're probably eating less of the saturated fat and the other things. And it just can tend to bind some of that cholesterol as well. So those are the two reasons why that's true.
Right. Gotcha. So one of the other things, when with blood work, especially that's become very popular nowadays, is talking about blood sugar levels, both fasting glucose levels and fasting insulin levels, and hemoglobin A1C as well. So hemoglobin A1C is basically the average of your blood sugar levels over the last few months, if I understand that correctly, whereas blood sugar levels is simply just kind of like in that moment in time. And I guess same thing with fasting insulin levels. I'm going to kind of jump to me personally right now. So like on y'all's document, your range is 5.7 to 6.4 as maybe like ideal healthy range, or at least for me and me particular. Mine is 5.4, so it's just a little bit under maybe that ideal healthy range. And I'm somebody that I consider has really healthy behaviors. Is there a reason why I might be out of that ideal healthy range, or why maybe blood sugar levels might be high, even if I am, at least in my eyes, living a healthy lifestyle with exercise and nutrition?
So I would say first off, you're not outside like kind of the ideal range. So just to kind of correct that assumption a little bit, 5.4 sounds like it's close to 5.7, but we kind of have the bottom end of ours is like if you're below that, you're pretty much ideal. Like normal lab markers, what other people would say is they don't care until you get to 6 or so. So when I look at your A1C numbers, first off, there's a couple things like your red blood cells, how quickly you turn those over that can affect your A1C up or down a little bit, regardless of what the actual average measurement of your glucose is. So there could be a little bit of that there. But in general, when anyone is between 5.0 and 5.5, I say that's ideal. Like as long as we stay there, I'm not really worried about you. Um, Fasting glucose is a measure that I could care less about because even if you are fasting, just like if someone surprises you, you get a little stress thing, like you're just some cortisol, you can bump that glucose up and stuff. So A1C is good. Even better would be with our patients. Frequently put them on a CGM so they can see with real kind of resolution how their glucose changes throughout the day. So yeah, I would say your 5.4 is in the ideal range for you. We would just want to follow it over time. If like in a year you go up to 5.6, oh, we're watching that. Another year you're at 5.8, and we're like, whoa, something's going on here, Nick. Like you've got 50 years here. You can't stay on this trajectory. But where you are now, without knowing where you were last year, where you're going to be next year, say, great. We just need more data later.
Great. Great. You mentioned CGM, so let's go down that rabbit hole just real quickly. Continuous glucose monitor is something where, if you guys aren't familiar, you can wear maybe a patch oftentimes on your tricep to get a real-time response as to where your glucose levels are based off of maybe exercise or based off of what you're eating, so on and so forth. How useful is a CGM, and for who is it useful, and who shouldn't even be concerned with maybe even getting one?
I think everyone can learn some things from it. It's not something that you need to wear for a long time. I look at it as something to get some education about yourself and how you respond to different foods, and then you can ditch it from there. So you'll learn important things, like you may be thinking like, okay, yeah, fruits are healthy for me. Then you see that, wow, like grapes and raisins spike my glucose more than chocolate cake does. Like you may see interesting things like that. You also may learn things like, holy cow, when I eat the same food, if I'm sleep deprived, I get a big spike compared to if I have slept well, which is just something about being well rested in our glucose disposal. You may see things like, this is really interesting. If I just do a 30-minute walk right after dinner, or just like 30 air squats, I don't get that glucose spike because I'm priming my muscles to take that glucose up. So you can learn things like that about yourself, about different foods, different activities, different lifestyle behaviors that affect and decrease those glucose spikes, which are also important. Your A1C does your average, but if someone was like this and they had the same average as someone who is like this, we're going to take and if you're not on a video, you didn't see what I did there. But even having the same A1C, we want to decrease the total spikes that your insulin goes, or glucose goes really high.
And what are the downsides of major spikes in glucose?
Your body just doesn't respond well to it. So there's different ways that kind of glucose can cause damage. There's microvascular and macrovascular. And so if you get a ton of spikes, it just is kind of stressing your system and potentially causing a little more damage than if you're more of a steady state, not having the big swings up and down. It also is going to be, frequently it makes people feel not great either to have their glucose spiking up and down.
Okay. Gotcha. I think last thing from maybe a blood work standpoint is vitamin D levels. I think it's getting more and more popular around the importance of being in sunlight. Oftentimes morning sunlight is even put on a pedestal as the most important time to get out in sunlight, to making sure your vitamin D levels are high. And I know me personally, I was surprised to see my vitamin D levels maybe a little bit lower than, at least again, what in an ideal range would be. So all that to say, what is the importance of vitamin D? Like, why is vitamin D such a crucial thing to be concerned about with regard to our health?
Yeah, we call it vitamin D, but actually it's a hormone. It's a steroid hormone that is really important in so many functions in your body. So that's why it's important, like immune function, potentially your risk of kind of cancer and some other things later in life. So risk factor for a lot of things. Also in how you feel and perform. So there's some interesting evidence that having higher vitamin D levels leads to better muscular contraction. So athletically and things, normally people think of less than 30 is deficient. We want to push up above 30, but for us, we want to push people up above 50 to really optimize. And there's some evidence, like for our athletes, that getting closer up to even to like 80, there may be some performance benefits.
Gotcha. I'm just curious on a personal standpoint with you and blood work. Is that something that you do regularly? Do you have any kind of like charts where you are assessing where certain markers move based off of maybe how you're changing your dietary behavior or your exercise behavior or other lifestyle factors? Like, how do you go about kind of across time interpreting blood work results?
So I'll tell you how we think about that in general. Like when we see someone, at first we do a really big panel to look at everything, get a holistic picture. From there, depending on what the issue is, will depend on the timing. So for example, for you, let's say we saw a bunch of inflammatory markers off, a lot of inflammation. That changes daily. So we may then talk to you and come up with a hypothesis of saying, look, hey, look, based on your DNA, you have an SH2B3 polymorphism. That means probably wheat and gluten are inflammatory. and you have an MCM6, which means probably dairy is. So let's cut those two things out and let's retest in a week. Look at your CRP, inflammatory markers, and we want to make sure you didn't do like a really hard workout that caused that to transiently be up. So you could repeat in a week, something like that. Whereas if your issue was cholesterol, your LDLP, your hemoglobin A1C, that's going to take us 3 to 4 months. So we may say eat less refined carbohydrates, like come up with some interventions, and then maybe be 3 to 4 months. So it depends on what is out of range. Also, then let's say everything is normal, because I think it's part of your question, like how often would you do routine? For me, like some people like to do it quarterly. I think that's a bit much. I'm just busy. So I'm usually like more like every 6 months. But if I'm going to make a big change, so let's say I saw a new paper and I think, oh, these senolytic supplements look really interesting, or I'm going to try a carnivore diet or a vegan diet, then I probably would do one of those things like for a month and get repeat just to see how things are changing.
Gotcha. So basically, it's like you said, if you realize there is a certain blood marker that is off or not in ideal ranges and you want to make a change to that in a somewhat short period of time, then you make the change, then you retest. And then, like you said, if you're making a other big change in some other area of your life, then you can, or some other fitness, maybe nutrition behaviors, then you can retest after maybe 3, 4, 5 months to see what that has done, and just from a curiosity standpoint.
If you're feeling perfect, if everything's perfect, you got no issues, and now you're not changing anything, once a year is probably fine. Just to make sure nothing is going out of balance, because things just do over time with this, with just entropy in the human body. And then if it's more often than that, we need a reason for it, so that we're not just doing it just to do it.
Okay, great. We're going to transition into the genetic testing side of this conversation. You already mentioned how with our health, generally speaking, DNA kind of plays 20% of the role. Epigenetics is 80%, basically what genes get turned on and off. And this has been something that I've just continually gotten more and more fascinated by after having done the genetic testing with you guys. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. So I kind of want to start off here at the top. It talks about macronutrients, and it says your level of fat intolerance, carbohydrate intolerance, and saturated fat intolerance. First off, just give me a rundown of what we're looking at right here. And if you're just listening on audio, then do your best. If you can watch on video, then you'll get a lot more out of this. But I'm essentially sharing my genetic testing health report and my genes for fat intolerance, carb intolerance, and saturated fat intolerance. So tell us about the importance of what looking at this can do for us with regards to what behaviors we should change or add in or stop doing.
Yeah, I'll be honest, not much for this. So I have my philosophy on macros is it just doesn't appeal to me all that much, because I'm thinking about specific foods even, and like what people are doing. So there is some value to this, and we constantly get asked about macro breakdowns, so we provide this. So for example, Mike and mine, just to compare the saturated fat intolerance, you're right in the middle. Mike would have been all the way to the right, very intolerant. I would have been all the way to the left, not intolerant at all. So that tells us something, like that I'm probably okay with kind of a ketogenic diet. He's probably better with a vegan diet. So you can get some information to this to adjust your macros. But to me, it really comes home when we like start bringing everything together to talk about foods. Just
Gotcha.
like you and I had a conversation before it started around sardines. So just as an example, I have a VDR SNP that means I need more vitamin D. I'm not sensitive to fats at all, which sardines have a lot. I have a BCMO that means I need more vitamin A. I have a collagen A 5A1 that means I need more collagen protein, and I have a FADS2 meaning I need more active omega-3, not the plant-based form. You bring all of those together, and now in looking at my labs and DNA, sardines are the world's perfect food for me, a clean source of all those things I need. So that's more interesting to me than like a macro breakdown. But the macro breakdown can be helpful if you're thinking about vegan and carnivore and ketogenic and all of those things.
Right. Let's talk about your experience personally with adding in sardines, let's say, or maybe anybody's experience with finding out like, okay, these foods are going to be really good given my gene SNPs. What would people expect to feel differently? Like, do people expect to feel differently within a mat? Like, more, do they get more energy? What do they feel and in what period of time? Or is it something that's just like, this is just going to be best for your long-term health? You might not necessarily experience any difference in the short term, but this is going to be best for your long-term health. So talk to us about how quickly you might experience benefits and what those benefits might be to eating specifically for your DNA.
Yeah, we care about both those things. We care about Nick now and Nick 50 years from now. So both of those are important. So when we have come up with interventions, it really needs to kind of be helping both of those, the future Nick and the present Nick, for example. So like with the sardines, for example, the other thing I didn't mention is like when it comes to foods to avoid, like kryptonite foods, I have a SHB23, meaning like wheat and gluten I'm very sensitive to. So one thing I didn't mention with that sardine recipe you and I were talking about earlier is I do like some crunch with it. So I eat these Parmesan crisps that are like zero. They're like a cracker substitute, but really good and not sensitive to that saturated fat. So, and as we were talking about earlier, you asked me like something that made me smile today, and I mentioned that food. My body craves that. Like I've now found this kind of perfect combination of me from like the genetics and the DNA. And I just feel fantastic when I eat it. Also long term, like I used to, when I first sequenced my DNA, I was doing Ironman events and ultra marathon stuff, and I would get all these tendon and ligament injuries. And when I found that collagen 5A1 SNP, that puts me at increased risk for that. So all the little bones and the collagen protein in the sardines, I don't get those injuries anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel amazing now. I crave it. I don't get those injuries. And then my risk for dementia, my grandmother had dementia and died. So obviously think about that. The omega-3 is incredible for that. So I'm doing something good for myself now, and a month from now, injury, and down the road with that food.
That's awesome. That's super. I bet people are getting more and more excited and intrigued about this by every second because of both the short term and the long term benefits. Now, to give everybody a little bit more context, basically, when you do your genetic testing, you get a gene from your mom, you get a gene from your dad, and both of those genes will determine whether you're heterozygous or homozygous for that gene. Give us a little bit more context as to just kind of that conversation, what people are actually seeing when they get genetic testing done.
Yeah, I'll use that example I just mentioned. So my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease, and I was very worried about that for my mother. So we looked at her genes, and sure enough, she had an ApoE4 gene. So yeah, you get one gene from your father, one from your mother. So I think she probably got an ApoE4 from her mother. Now, if she had gotten two ApoE4s, her risk for dementia would be like 11 to 13 times higher. Because she got one, it's like 2 to 3 times higher. So it's still higher. So like we put her on the program, and in 3 months, she lost 40 pounds, reversed her insulin resistance, and said she felt 20 years younger. But that's an example of how you inherit one from your mother and one from your father. And if you have two of a certain gene, it just tends to increase that risk that much more for you.
Right. And so I actually have the genetic testing pulled back up, and specifically the one that we're talking about, your ApoE status, and then the ApoE-E3/E3. That means I have E3 both from my mom and from my dad. And like you mentioned, E4 is really the one that increases your risk maybe the most for Alzheimer's and dementia. Let's say somebody does have an E4 or two E4s. What are some of the different lifestyle behaviors, nutrition, exercise, etc., that you would then, quote, prescribe to them to minimize their likelihood or decrease the chances that they get Alzheimer's or dementia?
I mean, the good and interesting thing about it is like it's the same thing for anyone who is trying to optimize their brain function now, which everyone probably wants that. I've met very few people who think they're too smart and they want me to decrease their brain function. And so it's things like optimizing the omega-3 levels, like we mentioned, optimizing their sleep, making sure they're not nutrient deficient in vitamin D, like we already mentioned, potentially magnesium, making sure that they don't have leaky gut and bowel issues, decreasing their gluten intake. Like, I mean, there's a list. There's a good book by Dale Bredesen. It's been out for a while now, The End of Alzheimer's. And in it, he talks, I think, about the 37 holes in the roof to patch. So there's a list of things. But instead of telling someone to do all of those things, we just basically look and see which of those are off in your blood work, in your sleep, and other areas. And then we focus on the holes that you have there and try to fix those.
That's great. That's great. What is your, I feel like Alzheimer's, and I'm very interested in the topic as well because my grandfather had Alzheimer's and passed away from Alzheimer's. What is your I guess, kind of your opinion and hope or the lack thereof with regards to preventing Alzheimer's. I feel like obviously, there is no drug that reverses it. What is your hope with regards to the ability to minimize, reduce your chances of getting it simply through lifestyle behavior, even I guess, like, obviously it depends if you're E4 dash something else, or have no E4 allele. But I guess just riff on that topic a little bit.
I think we need to stop wasting billions of dollars trying to develop the molecule that does it. Like we've done that, like tens of billions of dollars have been wasted in the drug development on this because that's where the incentives lie with pharmaceutical companies. You can clearly reduce your risk, prevent it. Even you said you can't reverse it. It's true in general, but I mean, my grandmother, I didn't tell this story, but my grandmother came to us, and when we first were starting, her MoCA score, which is your measure, your Montreal Cognitive Assessment, was a 16. We put her on the program, and normally you want Alzheimer's to go for like 16, 15, 14, slow declines, not 16, 10, 5. When she came back after 3 months, she was at 20. She had a 25% improvement. Now, she still, as she gets older and entropy, like you're going to decrease, but just those lifestyle factors made a huge difference for her. My mother, when we found the ApoE4 for her, I said, like, she was a wreck, like obese, metabolic issues, insulin resistance. All that was fixed in a few months with lifestyle things. And I can't predict the future, but what I told her, and I believe, is like, I don't think you're going to get it now. I think you'll probably die of something else, cardiovascular disease, cancer, like something else. But we've been able to push that out, that I doubt that's what you're going to get if you continue to do what you're doing now, Mom. Like continue to optimize your sleep and all these other factors. So I personally believe, just from the work of Dale Brez and a lot of others, that we certainly can do a lot about this. It's not hopeless like we thought 10 years ago.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's huge. This is coming from somebody who does genetic testing and obviously believes that importance of knowing your DNA is really critical. And the other thing about that is like, even if you don't feel like it's completely maybe avoidable because you don't have that sort of that positivity, you could probably at least push it off, or at least the severity of it. And if you've ever had anybody in your family who's had Alzheimer's, then that can be huge to push it off or decrease the severity of it. The next thing I want to dive into is methylation. I'm going to share the screen again. This is something that I really did not know very much about at all, but have begun to learn more and more about it after having gotten this testing done. First off, just tell us what methylation is in as simple of terms as we can understand.
Sure. Yeah. So methylation, I mean, to be very specific, it's when your body methylates or adds a methyl group to your DNA or protein or other molecules. That's a carbon with 3 hydrogen bonds. None of that is important in care. So to simplify and say what that means, if you have good methylation, you're able to like turn genes on and off appropriately and efficiently. If you have poor methylation, you may not be able to do that. So in general, we want our best measure of that, like we can look at your genetic risk factors for, are you going to be a good methylator or a poor methylator, but then to see how you're actually doing, we look at your homocysteine levels, because you may have genetics that put you at risk, these MTHFR genes for poor methylation, but you may be totally taking care of that by eating tons of folate, your B vitamins, choline, in which case your homocysteine is at a good level. So keep doing what you're doing with your diet. Whereas if your homocysteine is up, then we need to either fix it through diet, more B vitamins and such, more choline, or put you on a supplement for it as well. And methylation, in epigenetics, this is like a whole podcast at this point. That is the most exciting area of medicine and science in my mind. So one of the tests that we do, which we didn't talk about, is an epigenetic test. There's a company called True Diagnostic that looks at DNA methylation. While we look at your DNA, they look at 950,000 CPG sites to see how methylated each DNA site is, how much it's turned up and down, how you're expressing the genes. So we can look at the potential. They're looking at how everything is expressed, and you can get an incredible amount of information about your biologic age of pacing, these things called EVPs. Like that's the coolest and most interesting, I think, part of medicine and diagnostics right now is the DNA methylation testing.
That's awesome. So let's cap off the methylation conversation with one, homocysteine levels. What are maybe target ranges that we should be in? And then two, what are some, you mentioned already a couple already, but what are some specific foods that we can be eating to help improve our methylation?
Yeah, so I think some lab references want you under 14, but we don't consider that to be optimized. We want you kind of under 10 or like even closer to like 7 when possible, but under 10, I'm kind of happy with. Foods, I kind of mentioned folate, B vitamins, B12, choline. So leafy greens, vegetables, eggs, the egg yolk has a ton of choline. The sardines, like I mentioned earlier, like fish have a lot of choline in them as well. So that's some of the foods that would be helpful for methylation. There's also just products. We like a product that Thorne makes called Methyl Guard. It tends to do a really good job if people can't get their homocysteine down with food. Yeah, you got a bottle right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if the food's not good enough, Methyl Guard just almost always kind of pushes that level down pretty good.
Yeah, nice. Because I feel like I do a pretty good job of my diet of getting a lot of that stuff in, getting B vitamins, veggies, eggs. Sardines will be something that I start to attempt to implement based off the recipe that you've given me. But this, I'm holding up for those of you guys watching the Thorne Methyl Guard supplement that he just mentioned. This is one of the first supplements that I specifically take, and I'm currently taking that alongside vitamin D as well, given the data that I've received from my blood work and genetic testing. Now that I'm taking this methyl supplement, this is kind of selfish for me personally, and for other people who might be curious in their methylation levels. If I'm taking this for how long a period of time does it help me get into more of that ideal range? And then is it a supplement that I would need to continue to take, or just be hyper focused on making sure that I just continue to keep these foods at a premium in my diet? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure. So you shared the screen earlier. Your number, I think, was 12.7 was your homocysteine. I think a couple months of taking the Methogard, when you repeat, you'll be down to kind of 8 or 9 to a really good level. After that, do you have to keep taking it? If it was me, what I'd do, because there's a cost to these supplements, and is I would stop taking it and really focus on the dietary components, and then test again and see if you stay kind of at that lower level. If you don't, you may want to be back on it. But this is while we practice precision medicine, it's much better than the kind of guesswork and trial and error of normal medicine. It's not perfect medicine. We still want to have objective measures and follow and iterate and see where you are, and get more information over time.
Mm. Sardines, baby, here we come. Let's go. Well, this has been absolutely phenomenal today. You've provided so much, both education and context around blood work, DNA testing, what numbers are important, when you might need to get it, when you might not need to get it. And so I know there's a lot of people who are going to be fascinated and intrigued by doing this. And for a limited time, you guys can go get 20% off your checkout, anything at wildhealth.com. And I'll have a more specific link down below in the show notes in the description as well, to where you can get that 20% off discount. But talk to us a little bit. I did obviously the blood work and the genetic testing, and had some awesome follow-up calls with a coach and a medical professional, and that was awesome. Talk to us a little bit more about maybe some of the services that you guys offer, and for people who are listening, like who are maybe like, I'm intrigued by this, but where should I start? Give them a little bit of context as well around that.
Um, so yeah, wildhealth.com, like if you want our assistance. And I think, and our job really is, I look at our job as more education than anything. Like my dream is like, yeah, people come in, we get them educated, then eventually they graduate and they don't need us. They've got all the DNA, the blood work, and they can kind of do this on their own. So I don't think anybody like has to have us. Like we provide an incredible amount of data that's going to help accelerate things. But I really think you also, 80% of the benefit, and your health is going to be the lifestyle stuff, just focusing on optimizing your sleep, eating whole foods, as much kind of natural and whole foods as you can, getting plenty of movement and exercise and sunlight and all the normal things as well. So yeah, if anyone really wants to dig in and get this information, I do think we're the best place to get that. There's a lot of places to do DNA testing and everything, but I think DNA testing alone is almost worthless. It's got to be taken into account the whole picture of the labs, the blood work, everything else. So we're always happy to help people. Wildhealth.com. Also, actually, we have a podcast as well, Wild Health Podcast. So people just want education without all the testing. Like we we cover a lot of these topics there as well. And if you're a medical provider, we have a fellowship program training health coaches and physicians also if they want to learn more about the precision medicine. So we've got a few different ways for people to get education and testing and just learn more about themselves.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'm going to share on the screen real quick. If you guys want, we've got the link to this landing page in the description where you can go and get the code for 20% off your services at Wild Health. I would definitely recommend you do it. I know I have found a lot of value in not just getting the results and seeing them, but really feeling empowered for how to make decisions that are specific for me. I think that's what we all want to have confidence around, is we hear so much advice and information and outside noise that are from people saying that you should do this, you should do this, you should do this, where in reality, as you kind of started off with, it depends. It always requires personal context. And when you get some more personal numbers and more personal data, then you can have more confidence in the decisions that you make to improve your own health. So that's all we got today. I hope you guys learned a lot. I hope you shared this with a friend or family member who is intrigued by all of these kind of things. And make sure you follow the podcast if you don't yet already. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel if you don't yet already. Make sure you watch it there so you can actually see all the things that we broke down as well. But Dr. Dawson, that's all we got today. Really appreciate your time and all the education that you provided today.
Thank you, Nick. I really enjoyed it.
Damn, that interview exceeded my expectations. I had been looking forward to talking with Matthew for a while, and man, that one did not disappoint. If you're ready to lose 7 to 15 pounds this summer so you can look and feel like your best, then join the 10-week transformation from April 22nd to June 27th. Spots are filling up, so go ahead and get signed up. Because look, I'm not going to lie to you. The summer's hard. With all the vacations and celebrations, staying healthy and fit during the summer is just difficult. And look, you're probably not going to be perfect, but I'm going to be your biggest advocate when you fall down and you screw up. I'm going to pick you right back up, help dust you off, and get you right back on track. You can join today at nickcarrier.com/10WT, and we'll get started on April 22nd. Again, if you want to lose 7 to 15 pounds this summer so you can be as confident as possible when you put your bathing suit on, then go to nickcarrier.com/10WT to sign up today. Now, some of my biggest takeaways from Dr. Dawson were the following. Number one, DNA is just 20% of the story, but your epigenetics, meaning how you act in order to influence your genes, determines 80% of the story. Number two, if you're concerned with lowering your cholesterol, then you should do 3 things. 1, reduce your refined and processed carbohydrate intake. 3, increase your fiber intake. Or 2, increase your fiber intake, and 3, decrease your saturated fat intake. Then the third is if you want to decrease your chances of getting Alzheimer's disease, then you should do 4 things. Number 1, prioritize your sleep. Get at least 7 hours as frequently as possible. Number 2, optimize your omega-3 intake. I recommend things like wild-caught salmon and fatty fish, or potentially an omega-3 supplement. Thirdly, you want to optimize your vitamin D levels by making sure that you get outside and or supplement with vitamin D. And then fourth and finally, you want to optimize your gut health. And you can listen to the episode that we did last week with Dr. Vincent Pedre in order for specific tips on how to do that. And lastly, when it comes to your genetic test results, it can be really helpful to create a more customized approach to yourself. And the great thing about it is that you only have to get the test done one time because your genes aren't going to change. And if you'd like to get 20% off your genetic test with Wild Health, then click on the link in the show notes below and use the code TheBestYou20 to get 20% off at checkout. Again, TheBestYou20 to get 20% off at checkout. I truly think that more personalized testing will allow us to take our health to the next level, leading us closer to the healthiest version of ourselves and ultimately closer and closer to your best you.